Today I'm speaking with James Ellis, otherwise known as Meta Nomad. He is the host of the Hermetics podcast and author of the book Exiting Modernity. I just thought we'd begin by talking about your interest in philosophy. When did you first become interested in philosophy?
Yeah, as an academic possibility, it was probably during my I studied a bachelor's in fine art, because fine art was really all I was noticeably good at in school, and no other subject had really taken root at all. And it just happened that my art teacher sort of said, "Well, you're fairly all right at this." But it turned out about halfway through actual art school in a degree when I was doing fine art that I actually wasn't that good at making art. But I was fairly good at art theory, and you don't really have in the UK at least you don't really study theory or philosophy in any serious sense before college or before university. So in studying art theory and in thinking about art and aesthetics in that sense, I came to love philosophy in a more serious way. I mean, before that, I'd read things such as Camus and all the sort of cliche little things you read when you're an angsty teenager. And from that, I then went on, took a year sort of break, and then did a master's in continental philosophy because the thinkers in the continental sphere appealed to me more. And I think really what happens with most of these courses is that I'm not going to say I'm fully tired of the continentals now, but like now, if I could go back, I'd probably be drawn more towards an analytic thing. But I imagine if I'd studied analytic then, you might be more drawn towards continental. It's very common that happens. And unfortunately, the middle ground or an overarching way of studying is it's difficult to sort of comprise. But the long short is really that, I became interested in at sort of, I guess, 19, early 20s. And 19 was really the time when I would say I started seriously reading. I was never a big reader when I was younger either. So, yeah, it was around then. And, I think most people who get into philosophy probably had some form of not serious existential crisis, but such people who are interested in philosophy in any serious sense had some form of, and I don't mean this in the Marxist sense, but some form of alienation when they were younger. They didn't feel like they fit in, or they questioned things more than other people did, or they were critical of the way the modern world worked. They didn't just want to get a job and get on. And, that's what usually draws people towards the big questions, right?
I reckon alienation is like a precondition for philosophy. And I think that's borne out like in history when you think about when a period of like a philosophical flourishing begins. It's often when groups of people come into contact with different people and they're alienated from their culture, which gets them thinking about culture in a more philosophical sense. Like the classic example is the Greeks coming into contact, with various different cultures. And I think that naturally that gets you to think about conventions and customs. Yeah,
possibly. I mean, when we look at history in that sense, possibly it's difficult to tell it's difficult to really, it may seem that way, but I guess if you're in history, you don't see it that way. And it's one of the things, I mean, we're going to get to this and I'm not trying to push everything forward, but it's one of the things that in the essays in Exiting Modernity, and I'm writing more about this now as well, is that one of the things that is very difficult to see is the culture that you're within when you're within it and all the presumptions that come with that. And really, I guess in a certain sense, I'm really interested in that idea of what they call defamiliarization, of being able to sort of take the third person perspective of something you're fully deep rooted in that you don't even know you're deeply rooted in. So it's almost like, when you think about what you just said there about people in classical Greece coming into contact with other cultures. I'm not a scholar of the classics in any sense, but I can't imagine the people in classical Greece said, "Oh, here I am. I'm in classical Greece," and they looked around and they knew what classical Greece meant, right? And we've tried to do that with ourselves, but we do it in such a way where most of the presumptions about the quote unquote modern world. I mean, even the fact it's called the modern world presumes that it's almost like the tip top of the iceberg of everything, right? It's the best that could be, and we don't really take that and step back and look at it and do what you said and create some form of alienation where you really question all the foundations and presumptions that you're within.
Yeah. Well, I actually should have said at the start that that's the reason you're here today, is we're going to talk about your book, Exiting Modernity. Forgot to mention that. But maybe before we do, we'll just talk a little bit about the podcast. So I think I first came across your podcast. Maybe I'm not sure if it was a conversation with Curtis Yarvin, but anyway, I've been listening for about 2 years, I believe now, and you deal with a lot of like kind of eclectic and some I consider almost random thinkers, right? You deal with Postman and Marshall McLuhan. I mean, that's an obvious couple, but then also people like Carlyle, Junger. You deal with occult themes. You deal with people like Spengler. Yeah, like I said, someone, if they were just looking at the list of thinkers, they might see it as just sort of random, but I don't. I think there's some sort of link between them all. I was wondering, do you think that there's a theme, an overarching theme to your podcast?
Yeah. No, I do think there is, because in a certain sense, the theme of the podcast is almost can be defined in the negative. You could say, well, why has he left certain thinkers out? And you'll see that the figures I've left out, or at least the conversations that I'm leaving out, are the conversations that I would say have been had and are being had almost too much. So the as you said, I'm touching on a lot in the podcast, and it's over. I'm closing in on like 300 videos now, 300 talks, many of which are monologues, but at least almost 200 interviews of different thinkers, right? And I think the general theme is that sometimes there's a presumption that outside institutional or academic or institutionalized intellectual settings, that something can't really be rigorous, and we have to be sort of hold people at arm's length because they're not within certain containers that we build our credentials from, right? And many of the thinkers that I've talked about on the podcast, certainly you will find in the academy, but the general theme is that most of the people that I'm talking about are very serious, very rigorous. Even if they're occultists, you might go, oh, occultists or magic or whatever it is. But you read someone like Steiner, you read someone like, even Crowley or, and then as you mentioned, people like Carlyle, people like Spengler, people like McLuhan, and these people just haven't, they're figures, they're huge figures. They've got masses of work that's super, super interesting. And it's not being spoken about on a wider scale in terms of in the way other thinkers are. Now, I will be open about this, that when I first started the podcast, I thought I did have some thought that maybe there's some form of agenda behind this. And I don't mean a specifically left-wing agenda. I just mean there might be some agenda in the sense that some figures might be pushed under the rug for maybe even political or philosophical reasons. And actually, as I've gone forward, I've realized it's just absolutely not an agenda in this. It's sort of the disappointing thing, right? Not that I thought there was a cabal of continental philosophers somewhere pulling the strings of the academy and the intellectual world or anything like that. It's just that actually the bare truth nowadays, at least, of why certain thinkers get talked about more than others is one of the major factors, if not the major factor, that I've found just through talking to a lot of people, is ultimately the reality of grant funding and funding on a government level. Now, it's not me saying that governments are going, right, we're going to fund this person because we agree with them. It's really fashioned with respect to feedback loops. So what happens is certain figures get grant funding, which then means that people look at it and they go, oh, well, people are interested in those figures, so they give more funding to those figures. And that basically builds and builds and builds until only those figures are getting funding. And unfortunately, that then means that anyone going into the academy has to sort of pigeonhole themselves into those thinkers to get any amount of funding, which, these things are going to happen. However, there is thousands upon thousands of other thinkers out there who just don't get the time, don't get looked at, don't even get written about in any serious sense. And it isn't because their work is any less rigorous, any less interesting, or any less more important, because it's very difficult to describe what importance is. There is books and texts out there that are on par with the Critique of Pure Reason and Being and Time and these massive magnum opuses of philosophy that and some of which are almost on the threat of just being lost, for forever. So that's who I'm tackling. And I don't, just getting the name out there is really my task in a sense of giving people an hour to an hour and a half sort of overview intro to these figures, and just getting the name out there so people go, oh, I never heard of this person. And then the interest builds, right?
And it's so essential because sometimes it's really discouraging to just jump in to the book, even if you had heard the name, without a little bit of context. Sometimes it can be too difficult of a task. Yeah, anyway, I was going to say, I think one of the things I really like about your podcast is you want to make the content accessible without underestimating the audience's intelligence. And I think you do a really good job of that. Is you do deal with extremely complicated thinkers. You do so in a way that is accessible to someone who perhaps hasn't heard of them, but without actually underestimating their intelligence. So I think you do a great job of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I'm really, really key on, actually. Most modern media, most other podcasts that I've come across, most YouTube videos, there is a general trend, and we'll see this in plenty of people have written about this. You see this written about people like Postman, like McLuhan, actually, many people in the media ecology sphere.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm going to say that you've anticipated the next question because I was actually going to ask you about Postman, but yeah, go on.
Yeah. Well, they've written about this general sort of basically a dumbing down, and I would say almost another good term for it would be infantilization of people. People are becoming more infantile, in the sense that the general media just treats people as children. They don't expect them to really know anything, and I really hate that. And I hated that as a listener and as a viewer. So when I went into it, I just, on the one hand, I never particularly cared if people didn't fully get everything was being said, because I would say that I respect the listener enough to understand that they can go do further research or quickly pause the video and look something up if need be. But I would also just caveat that and say that if a guest mentions something super, super complex, I would usually, ask them to expand it. But ultimately, when we're talking about philosophy, we can't always start from the beginning. I mean, we shouldn't always start from the beginning. So if someone says something about Kant, something about Hegel, then it's just going to be left there and the conversation needs to naturally flow. So on the one hand, I sort of expect quite a bit from my listeners, but I have learned in time that my listeners have come to respect the podcast more for that, because you end up just saying the same thing and repeating yourselves as many other podcasts do if you're constantly treating the listener with kid gloves. And you can't ever really establish a position if you're doing that. And also many of the figures that I like to tackle are quote unquote dissident, controversial, whatever you want to call them, deplorable. And so I want to approach any idea, even the ones that I agree with, in the most objective way possible, which is to say, not that each and every single idea is itself in and of itself objective, but to approach the idea by saying what we're doing is we're just looking at the thinker or the idea or the book. We're looking at what's said. We're talking about how to understand it. We're talking about that in relation to its time, its context, what the author is saying. And that, in that sense, you look at the idea objectively. And from there, you can then go on and make your own opinion. At no point do I really feel I've seriously interjected my own opinion into things, because there's too many ideas out there for me to do that.
Yeah, I feel like what you have access to is either like verbiage and jargon, which is, you've probably read philosophical papers where they are obscure, but not but unnecessarily so. It's either that, or then you have they basically boil down all philosophy to the point where it becomes almost nothing more than self-help. Do you agree with that? It's like they boil down the message to the point where it's like you didn't need to mention the philosopher to say something like you should have goals in life. Like a lot of the time, Nietzsche becomes like Gary V. Basically, it's like you should have goals or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's taking a very basic premise and saying, the Nietzschean or the Lacanian or the whatever reading of it, in some sense, to make it seem more than it is, and that's quite common. And as you say, there's very rarely the in between, which is quite unfortunate, because it's the in between where a lot of the good work's happening. Because on the one side, the obscurantist side, as you'd say, you're talking to basically PhD students. You're talking to 2 or 3 people who understand it not for the sake of the truth and to expand knowledge, but for the sake of their own knowledge and for the sake of just proving to themselves they're smart. I mean, this is very common in philosophical texts, especially papers. But then on the other hand, as you say, as soon as you begin to treat things with kid gloves and treat the audience as if they're not going to fully understand, well, ultimately what you have to do at that point is start chopping segments off, which are too supposedly too difficult for them, and you end up with something that wasn't actually the idea at all. You end up with this very watered down vision of things, and this a lot of this goes back to this new modern mentality, which I don't like. Of people say, well, if you don't understand something well enough to explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it at all. And I just think that's absolute nonsense. That's really to do with almost like a quantified vision of philosophy, as if there's some way. It's like some things are complicated in a sense which isn't to do with obfuscation, or obscurity. They're to do with just understanding a lot of stuff. And I think, people should be treated with a respect in the sense that they can do their own research, basically.
I think what occurred was almost like a pendulum swing, because a lot of people go to university and they maybe study philosophy, and they had the experience of dealing, with obscure, jargon-heavy texts or lecturers, and they rebelled against that by explaining philosophy like that, to 5-year-olds basically. And like you said, that midpoint, I agree, it's totally missing, and that's actually why I would recommend anyone listening, or anyone in general, just to go and listen to your podcast. It's fantastic. I think also what you said about the dealing with these obscure thinkers who are at risk of being forgotten, and thinkers who actually, I believe, really should be front and center. Like in America, for example, it's funny. I think Paglia says, that a lot of the time they're dealing with French theorists. I don't know if that's true, when they could be dealing with some of their own thinkers, such as like McLuhan and Postman, who I think the reason McLuhan isn't read, honestly, is because a lot of people are not going to get the references that he constantly makes to literature, to other things. Do you reckon that might be why?
Yeah, I mean, the French, the whole thing. Well, there's 2 parts to that. I mean, the whole thing of Francophone philosophy basically flying across the globe at the rate it has is somewhat peculiar. The fact that all these, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, etc., this whole school is the predominant vision of philosophy, it seems, in most places, is peculiar in that national sense. You don't really get much of this anymore. That in Britain you'll study British thinkers, in America and study Americans. So, I mean, and that would hark back to sort of the hegemonic thinking that the supposed French school, in a sense, the deconstructions or the post-structuralists, would seek to be critical of, but they've also developed their own hegemony at the same time. With respect to specifically McLuhan, just from my own reading, I mean, McLuhan's someone I love to read, and I'd recommend everyone to listen to Bob Dobbs on McLuhan, really. I mean, he's the true McLuhan, the McLuhan thinker. But the thing with McLuhan is he's really so far beyond the medium is the message, as you say. Like, to actually sit down and read McLuhan is to just constantly be schizophrenically pushed with this amount of knowledge, which is way ahead of its time. But as you say, it's completely steeped in very serious literary references and figures and thought, and it's very difficult to tie together. The thing with McLuhan is it's a very specific type of philosophy, it's really theory. So it really is media ecology and media theory. So that would be one reason that, I mean, it's not strictly philosophy.
Look, I'm going to be honest with you. I tried to read McLuhan, and I think that I did enjoy it, but I just got tired of it. And I ended up reading that Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I feel like you get perhaps the central theme in a very accessible way. And of course, we sort of related this. In terms of the podcast as a medium, I wonder if there's something inherent in it which leads people to simplify. But I don't know, actually. I think that the podcast is actually a very good medium.
Well, one of the things the that podcasts have seemed to have done that radios perhaps tried to achieve. I mean, podcasts are often seen as a surrogate friend. So you more often than not hear people talking about podcasts and audiobooks sort of fall within the same category of media, or medium, you could say, in the sense that you more often than not hear people say, I listen to that podcast on the train, or I listen to that audiobook on the train. And so they are a replacement, they're a surrogate friend for a lot of people because because of the more conversational tone. Whereas a radio basically, because of the radio's format, the fact it has to be running 24/7. If you're talking 24/7, eventually you just have to be talking about, you don't have any time to prep anything serious, because you've got if you're doing a 6 hour long radio show, then your remaining 6 hours of that workday is then prepping for the next day, right? So you have no time to develop anything serious. But with a podcast, when it's 1 or 2 hours a day, and you've honed down to this niche, and maybe you've got other people with you, it becomes, for a lot of people, almost like 1 to 2 hours a day, or a week in my case, or a few more, that you basically, you're almost sitting down with a friend, and you look forward to that. And so the medium is more strictly replacing sort of relationships, in a sense. I mean, you wouldn't just sit alone and listen. Well, some people might, but you wouldn't just sit alone and listen to the radio, in the sense that it's actually replacing some form of dialogue in your life. Whereas with a podcast, I mean, many podcasts are actually structured around the idea that you're like in a room with your bros, right? And I mean, this is something I've tried to avoid. So
I don't like that style of podcast for me. Like the one, that's a good way of explaining it, where the podcast is essentially a surrogate, like for a friend, and they just talk. I prefer like the sort of radio interview, because I really feel like I want to get something out of it. Though I notice that those podcasts do tend to be very popular.
Yeah, they're by far the more popular ones. It's really, as you say, it's not something I'm interested in at all either. And yeah, I don't, I think, I mainly see the podcast as a medium, as a way to get information across. But yeah, I don't know. People like to constantly be in conversation with people, I guess.
Well, anyway, so I think that went for perhaps longer than I anticipated, but I just wanted to, there were so many questions I wanted to ask you about your podcast. But the reason you're here, and the reason I asked you to come on, was to talk about your book, Exiting Modernity. I thought we'd just begin by perhaps getting your definition of modernity. What is it in your mind?
Modernity is the thing that we all really have our own definition of it, but all these definitions cohere, and we sort of just intuitively know what it is and what we're talking about. To be modern, the modern world, this sort of simulacrum among things, where we know we're not getting through to the authentic or to the real, the thing which in a certain sense is stopping many people from feeling anything, makes people feel like things are drifting by. And it's in this sense that I think people often, many of the getaways, many of the quote unquote holidays or escapes, we hear about this language of getting away from the world for a bit or whatever. This whole idea, once again, of, I guess, in a way, putting forward the negative and saying, well, camping or getting away to the woods or touching grass, right, and all this stuff is in a constant sense this sort of desire for the desert outside of modernity. And for me personally, I think the only way to exit modernity, you can basically be physically and terrestrially completely within modernity and exit it simultaneously. Because for me, exit is solely internal. It's to do with uprooting presumptions about how you live, why you should live, what you should do, what you should believe, etc. And that's really what exiting modernity is. So modernity is, not to be too pretentious, but modernity is almost like an artificial state of mind which you're constantly choosing to enter into at all times. And the sad thing is, of course, like many prisons, most people who are in it don't realize they're in it at all. And you can't exit or escape anything if you don't know you're actually in it in the first place, right?
Yeah, when I first read the book, I'm not going to lie, I thought maybe this is going to be on like homesteading and, like buying canned food. I don't know. But yeah, no, it really is more about all the practices that you promote in the book are basically things like I call them mental practices or meditations, if you will. It's about changing your mindset. You emphasize throughout that, like, let's call it the modern mindset, right? You describe it a couple of times. It's almost like this state of, I think you described it maybe as like a lobotomy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that people have been lobotomized, basically.
Lobotomized.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was probably my most well-known essay, which got a fair amount of traction, called "The Global Lobotomy."
Yeah.
Avoiding the global lobotomy, I called it. And the definition of a lobotomy, which is something where they're basically taking a piece of your brain out. It was really meant for extremely unruly or extremely mentally ill patients in in a time when the medical establishment was fairly hammer and sickle about things. Hammer and chisel, I should say, and they just chunk a bit out. And the definition of it from that is to reduce the quality and intensity of your psychological life, of basically your internal life. I mean, the lobotomy is to reduce the quality of your internal life. And that, I don't think you need the physical mental procedure for that to be happening. I think that's happening for most people. And for me, it's happening in the sense that multiple quote unquote spectrums that we exist within are slowly getting tighter and tighter and more constrained. The Overton window, which is the sort of the window of political choice, is being constrained to a tiny amount. The sense of internal freedom is being constrained. The sense in which we can even act or believe we can act are getting constrained. And the problem is that these are getting artificially constrained in the sense that we actually still can do everything or most of the things which are outside of the spectrum, but we just have told ourselves we can't. And so we see it once again, it's like a feedback loop where more and more people exist within the same containment and constraints of certain norms. And because they exist within them, then everybody begins to exist within them, and et cetera, et cetera. And what happens is you sort of, you end up just basically doing things because everyone else is doing things, or there's this sort of unspoken rule that we do things that way. And it's this is going on and on and on, and the extent to which we can live is really slowly becoming reliant on a very small set of seemingly consumerist physical choices regarding what we buy or what we do in terms of consumption regarding media. And one of the sad things about this is it isn't that the other options have been erased. It's that either we believe that we shouldn't do them anymore, which I don't think is the case, but really it's that we've been taught to believe that they're just so absurd that we shouldn't do them. And everything falls within sort of the realm of utility and productivity. And so the lobotomy in that sense is the reason you're miserable is because you've self-willingly given yourself a lobotomy regarding the quality of life, and now you basically want something which is outside of all the windows that you've artificially constrained yourself within, but can't see that anymore because you're within the lobotomy. And I don't think it's all too difficult to get out of, and some people just can't. A lot of it's almost like a self-hypnosis. You see this in lots of books regarding crowds and mobs and things. But yeah, that's reduction of the quality of life, basically.
Yeah, so I think that most people when they think about modernity, they think about it as something that started in maybe the 19th century or late 18th century, and you associate it with the factory, eventually the public school, and maybe telecommunications. And I think, I'm not a Marxist, but I think that when Marx, I remember back in the day listening to, a talk some Marxists gave on alienation and thinking that was actually a very solid idea. And then the overarching idea that the way that we work has implications for culture, for psychology, very, very, in some instances, weird implications that you would not anticipate whatsoever. I think that's true. And I think that essentially what's happened is like that agriculture reflects culture. The factory begins to in some ways we begin to mimic the products that we create. It's not an original point, of course, but you notice this sort of standardization, this homogenization, which began with the factory, the shoes, and now it's happening to us. And there's a couple of pretty powerful passages in Exiting Modernity where you speak about people from your high school, and you notice that like these same sort of platitudes just come up again and again. And I remember being very moved by it because, you know, whenever you go to a party with like and maybe like there's a lot of people there who are in their late 20s and they're working a professional job. They've spent like 20 years almost in an education institution, is that you just notice that like some of the things that are said is so predictable. It's very tiresome. And you expressed a similar feeling in the book.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing is, I mean, there's actually a writer called Maurice Nicoll who talks about this very specifically. He calls this people's reels, which is really what he's thinking back to. It's very early sort of forms of recording devices where you'd actually reel up literally a physical wire, and that's what it would be. It really, you know, you could think about it basically a cassette player in a way. And he would argue that most people only really have 4 or 5 common reels that they constantly talk about. What he's really saying is most people only have basically the same script, and you know, they're at most sort of 10 scripts. They have a script when they're mad, script when they're feeling good, and they'd always mention the same things about how they never got a certain car or a certain job they should have had, or, you know, a bad day at work, or all this sort of thing. And the more you go on, the more you realize, as soon as you begin to realize this, you do get to the point where you can actually predict what people are going to say. And once you get to the point where you can genuinely predict the words, inflection, body language of what someone is about to say next, a lot of stuff really begins to fall apart quickly, because you realize in a sort of B.F. Skinner type behaviorist setting, modernity has constrained habits, reactions, impulses down to an extremely disenchanted, secular, and minimal set of basically utilitarian phrases, which under the hood are all saying the same thing, which is that I am normal, I'm part of this modern world too, you've got nothing to fear, you know, we all know how bad taxes are, how bad the government is, oh, my car broke down, oh, I had a long day at work, oh, I'm worried about the dentist, oh, all death's bad. And it's a whole host of presumptions, assumptions, reactions, which just continually bolster to the point where to state something genuinely different and actually to pause, to listen, and to give someone an answer which is completely not off, which is completely supposedly for them off script, you usually find people extremely befuddled for a few seconds before they sort of shake their head and go back into the automaton mode. It's like a shock. It's like a shock to them.
For sure.
And yeah, that's what we need to do more of.
Well, I think that we'll take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to speak about spontaneity, because we speak about that. And then I also want to talk about this idea of enchantment and disenchantment, which is obviously linked to it. Okay, so we'll take a quick break and then we'll come back. Okay, so we're back. And before we left, we said we were going to speak about spontaneity, which is a word that is used quite a bit in the book Exiting Modernity. Why is it so important to be spontaneous?
Well, the difficulty with spontaneity is that I don't really think you obviously can't do it. That's the definition of spontaneity. But a lot of modern spontaneity is like, oh, we just spontaneously happened to do the fun things of the modern world, right? Like, all spontaneous night out. And it's like, well, okay, but that's not really spontaneity. And I don't want to define spontaneity because it's something you're going to find in between spaces, or it's something you sort of have a compulsion to do, but everything in the world tells you you shouldn't be doing it, or that it's in some sense wrong. And I don't mean like breaking the law or anything like that. I mean, I don't know what I mean, but and so it's not the most amazing practice in the world. I mean, it really all begins with being attentive of the modern world and what you're assuming. I mean, beneath every action and every consumption and everything that you do is ultimately a belief regarding that thing that you do, in some sense that it's going to bring you closer to some ideal that you have faith in, whether that would be for people who have real faith, such as God. But if not, you might have a belief towards earning more money or being happier or being more content. And so each action and each action and each act of consumption, underneath that is some belief in it, which you're being led towards. And ultimately, being spontaneous, I think, begins from a true questioning of where those beliefs might have arisen from. But it's very difficult to talk about spontaneity because, as soon as I say, well, that's being spontaneous, it's no longer being spontaneous. So it's quite a tough one.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying about, I think that's a really good point, is that spontaneity in a consumer culture could easily just become doing what you've been conditioned to do, because you go, oh, I had a sudden impulse to buy that thing. But no, I think that it's very, very important. The reason I mentioned the party before as a place where I often feel very dispirited is because it's ostensibly a place where people are spontaneous, or at the very least, they're less rigid and the mask comes off a little more. What I find so dispiriting about going to parties sometimes is that you'll notice that, they've got all of the aids possible in terms of like alcohol, making you less inhibited. And yet, like, you can often walk into those environments, particularly if they're sort of professional, white collar working people, and it will still feel so incredibly rigid, right? And you will, like I said again, you will have a conversation where it feels like you're in the office. It's all very polite and cordial, and no one says anything that like anyone will find even slightly offensive or anything like that. So that's the reason I don't know. I find that you're definitely onto something when you say that there's this real lack of spontaneity. And I think that you almost define modernity as, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but one of the things that I took away from the book was that like modernity in some ways is a destruction of spontaneity. Like that is what the modernity is in a way.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, and I don't want to fall into that, like, oh, it's just some like cog in the machine industrial thing. I mean, I'm certainly sympathetic to the writers who've been saying this for years about just a cog in the machine, or welcome to the machine, sort of a Pink Floyd thing. But the problem with a lot of that rhetoric, that the thing with exiting modernity, I think the difficulty with it is that, unlike many of the countercultural movements, tune in, drop out, or whatever that one was, and many of the people who were very early critics of, the machine, as they called it, or the system, as they called it, they foresaw some ability to supposedly, and I would always cite the book by Richard Fairfield called Modern Utopian to basically show how this whole project was a fraud and a failure, but to drop out the machine and just, live this sort of like nomadic existence in the desert or something, or start a commune, and ultimately all this proved to me was that, like there is nothing wrong with society in some form. We need social interaction. However, it's clear that that also has the inverse effect, that ultimately it can stifle people, and people end up very rigid and not really, and they end up denouncing their own possibilities for liberty and for freedom and for as you say, yeah, a good word for it is for spontaneity, to be able to live and to be less rigid. And but the thing with exiting modernity, and really for me, it comes from a lot from Ernst Jünger's concept of the anarch, is that we still have to live within the modern world, right? And most of the criticisms of the modern world are very binary. They're very black and white. It's either like, you're either a slave to the machine, or you have to exit and destroy everything. And I think that's an extremely dangerous and silly way to think about things, because, well, if you're a slave, you probably don't know you're a slave, and it doesn't really matter anyway. Or if you want to destroy everything, you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of benefits to modernity. There's so much more comfort in the modern world than we've ever had at any point in history. I would personally argue that many of the other faults that, regarding religions and even medicine actually have come nowhere near as far as we think they have. But the point is, you have to live within it. There's not going to be some radical overhaul change, and whenever there has been in history, it just ruins everything and causes mass death. You have to live within it, and you just have to realize the presumptions you're living in. And basically, you can live within it and realize that you are constructing your own, most of the time, you are constructing your own misery within the modern world. And this is a super controversial thing to say for most Westerners, that I don't personally believe in the Western definition of poverty. I think it's an absolutely nonsensical, ridiculous idea. But it's probably one of the key areas where the assumptions of the modern world are leading more and more people to misery. And that is basically, currently in a spiral and a feedback loop, which is going to lead many, many people to misery in the years to come. But there you go.
Well, yeah, I think that Heidegger quoted this poet, and I can't remember where, but he said something like, where there is great danger, there's also great potential. And he's talking, of course, about technology. I'm in no way like a techno optimist. I think that, yeah, there is obviously, and one of the reasons that I enjoy your podcast is I enjoy learning about various anti-tech thinkers. But I do believe that, technology actually does have great potential in this exiting project. And I mean, you yourself would be an example of that, right? Where now you're living off, a podcast, this is an example of how technology has actually enabled you in some ways to take a step back. You don't need to live in a busy city doing these things. I believe you live in rural England. So, yeah, it is. I think that one of the warnings that is said again and again throughout the book is you can't really give in to despair, and you shouldn't just spend your entire time abstracting and criticizing. You need to actually start to think about practical steps. The book begins by saying, exit is a practice. It's a practice. So do you want to just elaborate on what you mean by that?
Well, it's a practice in the sense that it's constant, and anyone who's had you look at many of these so-called exit writers, what they often do is they make this clear-cut thing, like, we haven't exited until we're, in X location with Y resources, with Z political system. Like, we haven't. It's like, that's just nonsense. I mean, these things are a process, and things will change as things go along. You're not just going to overhaul everything in one foul swoop, and that's the silly thing to do, as I've said. And so it's a process in the sense that, you grow as an individual, the institutions around you will change, your beliefs will change, the resources will change, technology will change. And so exit is a process in relation to how you live. I mean, if you wrote a book about exit in 1970, it's going to be fairly different from how exit is now. One key figure would be a big, almost like the elephant in the room of many of the exit writers is, well, what's your relationship with the social media and with smartphones and with computers? I mean, mine's not particularly great. And that's, one place to start, but you certainly didn't have that in the 1970s or the 1960s. And so in the sense that collapse is also a process, on that same river, exit is also a process, because as things go along, they react with changes that also happened, and so in the sense that you're like, well, the only way we'd exit is do this. You go, well, it's amazing that you can see the future. You know, when these people proclaim such things, really, exit as a process is saying you you bring a lot of misery to yourself by acting in such a way that you tell yourself that you're not in the situation that you're in. Right? It's like a realism. You do live in the modern world. You do have to earn money. These aren't terrible things. You know, it's probably a very comfortable job that most people live, right? Especially if you're the kind of person who's listening to philosophical podcasts. So you do have to earn money. You do have to live. These things aren't going to change overnight. So that's something you have to do. And in the sense that you just completely deny it, or basically that your mind is so far off in some radically politically alternative future that you believe that you should be living in it, you're just bringing misery to yourself. Deal with what you have, and if you can change, it means a very stoic position, I guess. If you can change it in some way, then slowly walk towards that. It's not going to happen overnight. And if you can't change it, then you have the right not to be miserable about it. But most people like being miserable, so that's always a hurdle.
Yeah, so that actually, what you just said, reminded me of a passage, and this is something that I want to get into. When I say that, I'm talking about the reference you just made to the person who's constantly envisioning utopia, and this is what things should be like. So it says, it's the realization that expending your energy on groupthink is really expending your energy in much the same way you do for your employer, allowing it to become the product of someone else's end goal. Stop looking for validation or vindication. And when I read that, I thought to myself, there is this sort of so when we seek vindication or validation, you can do so in a sort of crude way, which would be consumerism. But actually now, among most of the people I know, whilst yes, they're still very much absorbed in like consumer culture, no doubt. I noticed that the forms of vindication and validation that they seek, it's more like a status game. So often it's, more careerist. I think I've put it before, like careerism is like consumerism for the middle class. You know what I mean? It's like they try to impress people by virtue of, oh, I'm doing this. But again, you're seeking validation. But then another thing to keep in mind is what you've just said, where there's like maybe the political revolutionary who seeks validation from their group. But in some ways, this is the problem, is we're always living vicariously through others, and we're always seeking. I don't think there's anything actually wrong with that. Like, again, the Greeks, I think that they had this word thumos, which is seeking recognition. But there's something very different about that. I don't know what it is, from seeking validation or vindication in this sort of Weasley way, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, or validation, I mean, yeah, like I said in my book, I mean, you're just validating someone else's thing that you probably haven't thought through whether or not you truly care about it. And the big thing for me with revolutionary groups is anytime someone uses the we, the collective we, right? We should change this to this. We should do this. No. Who's this we? I'm not part of it, and I never will be part of it. You didn't ask me. People need to realize that what they're saying is I. Okay, and when you realize that, when you change that, you go, and you realize what, if they're saying we need an overhaul of the capitalist system, is a common one. You suddenly change that to, I think we should overhaul the capitalist system. You realize, well, why? Why am I following this? Why? Well, I've got stuff to do. I've got things to be writing. I've got things to be making, and I just don't buy it. But with regards to validation, I mean, people move between so many positions so fast that I find it hard to see that how you couldn't see it's transparent unless you're within it. And like you said, I think we're at such a stage of consumerism that it's actually very easy to get quote unquote high status goods at an affordable price. And so you have to move on to sort of an abstraction regarding status. And what you end up doing is sort of a status regarding experience. So it's like, did you get to the right restaurant? Did you go on the right holiday? Did you go to the right political march? Are you into the right whatever, I don't know, whatever it is, leftist text, blah, blah, blah. And in doing that, as you say, it's validation. And then you should work backwards and go, who am I trying to impress? Why am I trying to impress them? And what is my actual belief there? And how much basically of my own finite and personal energy am I just expending on something which is, I never even thought about until someone else put it on my plate, right? It's ridiculous.
I want to try and go into this, just get your thoughts on it, because it seems to me that when we talk about validation or vindication, right, like there is a certain form of status seeking, which I genuinely think is one of the worst things in the world, right? Where basically they're looking for a pat on the head from the teacher. You know what I mean? But in a broader way. And that strikes me as, again, contemptible. It's at the core of like a lot of the problems that we face, whatever. But then there is a different form. I don't want to call it status seeking. Again, it's that Greek concept of seeking recognition. And I don't know, like for some reason I see it as distinct. I feel like what I'm trying to get at is you don't want to, I wouldn't want to promote the idea that you shouldn't strive. And I know you wouldn't want to either. And I know that one of the natural things that motivates people to do things, to suffer, to strive, so on and so forth, is the desire to be recognized. This is something Plato talked about. So do you see that there? Like, do you see what I'm getting at? Like there's a tension there, because I think that actually striving for recognition is a good thing, but the way that most people go about that is actually terrible.
Well, the problem with the whole idea of me criticizing, if I was to say do or don't strive, is, and this is something that hasn't arisen. People use the word capitalism completely wrong. It's an economic word. It's nothing to do with the way people. They could maybe talk about competition or consumerism, but usually people actually mean something completely different when they talk about capitalism. It's nothing to do with capitalism.
They mean modernity, right? Don't they?
I think most of the time they do, which is really, you realize that modernity is a very human and a very, as you say, status-driven thing. But back to this idea of striving. If you were to say to someone, you should be striving, you should be ambitious, it would make sense. But if you'd say to someone, don't worry about striving too much, it would almost seem defeatist. Now, one of the things I try to get across in Exiting Modernity, I believe, I probably need to reread it soon just to go over my own thoughts on it. But one thing I would say now, at least, is that one thing, and this is why I emphasize that it's not capitalism, because capitalism doesn't care, actually. And liberty, in a sense, this is where I think liberty is found and where the foundation of liberty is. It's modernity that's the problem here, and the state, I would say. It's that, and this is something that so many people need to learn, and so many so-called self-help Jordan Peterson type gurus really need to start saying, is there is nothing wrong with having a normal life with a normal wife or husband, with 2 children, with a house which is well put together, with some hobbies, and you do that life and you make some friends and you do some exciting things and you work a 9 to 5 and you and then you retire and you pass away. Now the reason, and that has nothing to do with striving. Within that life, internally, are the more important things. And this is why modernity is so void of meaning for people, is because here's the thing. The basic foundation of history, human history, up until basically the early 1900s or post World War II, has been what we would now consider to be abject poverty. Up until now, 95% plus of all humans have lived most likely in what we would currently consider squalor or poverty. Right now, we are in really a fantastic state in the world. And, I'm speaking from a certain context, sure. Now, we are in a fantastic state. Okay, the average person lives a life of absolute splendor. It's modernity that teaches you to basically keep going, in a sense that you don't actually enjoy what you've got, right? Some of the average items that the average person can acquire extremely affordably these days, they don't put a second thought towards. And so it's not to do with not striving. The freedom and the meaning, and because modernity is solely external. It doesn't have any time for internal principles. It's not a human, it's not really interested. What have principles and values got to do with the increase in the hegemonic containment of modernity, right? And so you have there's almost, we're closing in on what, 8 billion or 9 billion people on the planet. I've lost count. Not every, and even in the West, let's say whatever, there's a billion. Let's just say, for argument's sake, there's a billion people in the West. Not every single one of you is going to have the life of your dreams. Okay. Not every single one of you is going to be a millionaire. Not every single one of you is going to be externally have an amazing life. However, every single one of them does have the same potential for every single, in relation to every single other person, to know themselves and to really dig into their presumptions internally, which might be leading to their misery. And that is to do with looking around and realizing that the so-called quote unquote average life, and this is why I wanted to highlight that idea of poverty and averageness, is just not, it's not. That's what most people are going to do. And as soon as you start saying that, that's when those words like striving and ambition become, in a certain sense, problematic. So striving and ambition should always be in relation to internal goals, principles, values. Because if they're external, then they're inherently infinite. They have no end, right? Like as a strive or as a goal, I want to make money. Great. Where the hell does that end? I want to own property. Cool. Like, you now want to own the world. But internal principles and internal values, these are things that can be validated by yourself. And these are things that you can consistently grow. And as soon as you realize that the external world should only really be a tool in developing those internal, the internal capacity for personal subjective liberty, that's where you find freedom. And so telling people to strive, what you're really saying, once again, right? If someone says to you, you should really strive, you should say that person, says who? Why are you telling me to strive? Because if someone else is telling you to strive, well, they're putting their personal revealed preference or their personal preference or what they believe striving is and what they believe should be strived for on you. Nah, fuck that. You should strive. And tell you what, if you want to strive, if you want me to strive for something, why aren't you striving for it? Right? That's the question that you should always push back on people. You should really be striving if you want to do it, because your personal, subjective, internal striving or ambition is just likely entirely alien to anyone else, right? That's what I'd say.
Yeah, I think that the way that you could put it, perhaps in layman's terms, and this is the only way I know how to put it, is there's some sort of difference perhaps between self-esteem and status. Does that make sense? And that you should seek to esteem yourself. And I suspect that there are things that you know you should do and that you would respect yourself more if you did them. And I guess you always need to be interrogating those things, because to what extent are they coming from an internal instinct or desire, or are they just some sort of conditioning, right? And I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Ideally, to esteem yourself, you would be pursuing something that you see as an ideal, and that's what a virtuous person is like, right? And that's what I would need to do to esteem myself. The difference with status is that it's essentially you've been conditioned to respect these people. And it sounds weird. You can look at these people, right? You can go and take people who are very, very successful, lawyers, politicians. It's a well-known fact that a lot of them are on antidepressants. And a lot of them, I genuinely think, not all, but a lot of them, if you talk to them, it would be very apparent that, they understand that society confers honors upon them, but that they don't actually esteem themselves. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is too often when people are told, this sort of stuff that's very valid about status, what they interpret it as is, well, I can just be happy doing whatever, but often there are things that they really should be doing differently. Does that make sense? Like, you don't want someone to hear, oh, you don't want to strive. And they go, okay, well, I'll just spend like 6 hours a day on my phone. You know what I mean? Like, and that does happen. People get into these, they have these terrible habits, but then they go, no, I'm happy. So it's a double-edged sword. And I think that a good way to perhaps conceptualize it, and someone could do it more in a more sophisticated fashion, is the difference between status and self-esteem, is that you should seek to esteem yourself, but you shouldn't search for a pat on the head from others, because it'll never actually satisfy that internal desire, if that makes sense.
I mean, as Jack Parsons says, I mean, it's the name of his book, Freedom is a Double-Edged Sword.
You finish with that. You finish with that. Perhaps I was thinking about that. That's the final quote.
You and I love that quote, because ultimately it's the position, it's the part of freedom and the part of liberty that people don't realize, is that with I mean, it's a Spider-Man quote, right? But with increased freedom comes increased responsibility. But even on a minor level, that happens. I was like, I think people think about that in the wrong way. So when you get more freedom, no, the Spider-Man one was to do with power. Sorry, freedom is a double-edged sword. Freedom and responsibility. People may read that as that you get more freedom, and so you have to be responsible that you don't do, that you used it well. And it's actually to do with more freedom comes more responsibility to yourself. Exactly. Because so many people are reliant on unfree mechanisms where they are basically told what to do, is that they don't need to take responsibility because someone else is taking responsibility for them. That's what schooling is. That's what education is. That's what the academic system is. That's what the army is. That's what institutions are. They're basically daycare centers for adults. You get here at this time and you do X, Y, and Z throughout the day, and then you can go home and then and then you do what you want, right? It's just daycare. And the increase of freedom, you increase your responsibility, but you increase your responsibility towards yourself. And so it's a double-edged sword in the sense that if you want to start exiting modernity, it's a tough thing, because you're going to start pulling stuff out from underneath you that really have been your fundamental values. It's like you can't just it's the reason you can't suddenly exit, because if you were to untangle the presumptions of many of these people who are deeply rooted in modernity, it would be the same as killing their God. Because they wouldn't have anything else to replace it. And so it has to be a slow process. But equally, I would always emphasize that I am not ever going to tell anyone what they should do. If you truly sit down and you do what the Oracle of Delphi originally said, and know thyself, and you come to the conclusion that you genuinely are happy in your 9 to 5 marketing job in a cubicle office in a skyscraper, good. You have actually exited modernity just as much as the homesteader. But it's the internal process which is the important thing. You've got to the kernel, and you've really deliberated on what it is that you truly want, and whether or not what it is you originally wanted was actually built on the presumptions of someone else saying you should do X, we should do Y, etc.
Yeah, there was something when you mentioned the daycare thing, I couldn't help but think, like, I think at some point in the book you say, we are all unique in the sense that we all do have unique experiences, but you still recognize there is this herd. But I was thinking about, the reality is, what is it? Like you said, 6 billion people, and all of these unique instincts, dispositions, and yet like we're funneled into like almost a handful of acceptable avenues. And it's it's really hard to believe that is, I genuinely think, like, again, going back to the lobotomized existence, it's like, it's hard to believe that we're experiencing the full spectrum of a human life, or even like normal human emotions, if we're just being funneled into such a small variety of experiences. But again, I think that one of the things I like, and one of the things that's definitely come out over the course of this conversation, is a sort of optimism, I think, and also, recognizing that there are things you can do obviously starting small, like if you are working some sort of marketing or insurance job, it's just perhaps, yeah, beginning to introduce, like I think doing some of the practices that you suggested. Actually, sorry, I've been rambling, but maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the practices, because someone who's listening to this conversation maybe can walk away and try one of them. What's one of your favorite practices that you suggest in the book?
Well, the one that I really it sounds so banal now I think back, but it's just a questioning practice, and it's to do with going to the shop and just beginning with a sort of a discursive practice regarding consumption, which is when you buy outside of the things you need, such as food, etc., and toiletries or whatever, you come to buy something and you follow the desire back as far as you can. Why am I buying this? Well, I'm buying it because I want to be entertained. I'm buying a Netflix, whatever, I don't know, subscription or something like that because I want to spend the next hour watching some Hollywood mass-produced movie because you want to be entertained. Why do I want to be entertained? Well, I've got sort of an hour to kill before bed, so I've got to kill time. Why do I want to? That's a classic one. I would say is a lot of people do that, right? They buy a piece of entertainment or media because basically they got free time at night that they want to kill, and so they want something to entertain them. And then you get into serious questions. Okay, well, why do I want to just go through time and it's just being then filled, right? Why? The question you would then maybe start asking yourself is, why have I not got something else which genuinely interests me that I can use my time for? Why do I just want my time to pass by? And you might get in some really deep existential wars. You say, well, I want my time to pass by because actually there's nothing really rooting it or anchoring it to any meaning right now. And then you say, well, why haven't I got any meaning in my life? And you go on and on and on. And, there's questioning practices like that. There's other little bits and pieces I've put throughout the book, but it's beginning really what that practice is. And it's a way to question your presumptions. A good one to begin with as well is to question why you have a car. That's a classic, because you follow that thought, you go, well, why do I have a car? The first thought normally for most people is, well, I need to get to work. Now, so all of a sudden you need to get to work. So I need, well, why did I need the car in the first place? So I could get to work, but I needed the job so I could pay for the car to pay for the house. And that whole discursive network really begins to unravel. And you end up realizing that the reason that you are part of the consumer society, as deep as you are, is to continue your existence within the consumer society. Right? There's so much you do within the consumer society that is only needed for the continuation of your existence as a modern consumerist, right? And yeah, you'll begin to find a lot of I don't know, sort of lacunae they're called, clear gaps of why you do certain things. You do things just because you do them, eventually, is the reason. And from that, I think you can begin to minimize, you can begin to not deconstruct, but you can just begin to, you've had layers and layers of stuff put on you over years and years and years, and you start pulling them away, you just find generally more peace. You realize you don't need things, you don't need these huge ideals. It's fine to just be for a bit. And that's not a Buddhist thing, that's not a Taoist thing, it's fine to just be for a bit and you get your bearings, right? Modern life is seemingly fast, but you can just pull all that stuff off, put it away, it disappears, you realize you can just be for a bit and it's nice. And from there, begin again. You get your bearings and head off, find what you want to do.
All right, wonderful. I think we might have one more music break, and there's a couple of questions I want to ask you. Not pushback per se, but maybe just challenging certain concepts. So, are you happy to come back again for one more segment?
Sure thing, man.
Okay, cool. Okay, so we're back, and I wanted to talk a little bit about modernity again, right? Like, not modernity in a philosophical sense, but modernity as a historical phenomenon, beginning in the 19th century, leading to the advent of like the factory, the public school, the standardization of products, but then also the standardization of people. Now, I'm wondering if this is in fact even a product of modernity. Perhaps it's a far older phenomenon. And I think that it's safe to assume that you probably have a cyclical view of history rather than a linear one. And that maybe if we look at, for example, the Chinese grain state. I recently spoke to Raw Egg Nationalist, and he was speaking about how in China, the walls were just as much to keep people in as they were to keep people out. People would try to flee this backbreaking agricultural labor whenever they could. If we consider modernity again, like what's wrong with it? What's the problem here? In some ways, the problem is the breakdown of spontaneity, right? That comes about because of mass conditioning. Okay. Well, if you look at China, you could, or even, perhaps medieval Europe for a peasant, right? You imagine that for many people, their life would have lacked spontaneity, but then throughout certain points, perhaps there are breakthroughs, revolutions, different changes, and then there's a sort of period of wildness. That's a little bit over the top, but what I'm getting at is the problem really modernity, or is the problem civilization itself?
No, the problem isn't civilization. I mean, the key problem, one of the key problems I think we could see in philosophical terms, and René Guénon is probably the most famous theorist on this idea, is the very clear change from an experiential existence of quality to quantity, from qualification to quantification, if you want to put it like that. And not only that, which is to say that we've moved into a time where everything is quantified, right? It's like, how many square footage of land do I have? How much time do I have left in the day? How much does my keyboard cost? And status is, to a certain degree, related to credentialism, is related to items, is related to cost, is related to degrees, which are all in themselves built from the ground up from quantification. But it's not just the move from quality to quantity in that sense with regard to our internal experience. It's because there's nothing wrong with quantity, right? If we didn't have quantity and they said, how much milk do you want? I go, well, some, right? Quantity has its bounds. The problem is that in overstepping its bounds, quantity has tried and basically succeeded in the modern world, has attempted to basically usurp quality, in saying that you actually don't need quality, that quality is superfluous because quality can't be subsumed into quantity. That is to say, if you have for instance, if you take a genuinely an experience which has a quality and intensity, in Christian lingo, you would say that it's vertical. It goes upwards in its experience. You can't quantify it. Say, if you were to say, well, how good was the experience of the birth of your child? You don't go 7 out of 10, right? That's just not how it works. And so that's the biggest change, and getting people out of the quantified mindset into the qualified, we could say qualified, or mindset of quality, is difficult because you can't use the quantified mindset to get there. You have to give them experiences, and all of a sudden people want to quantify experiences. Oh, it's the gig was 2 hours long. They played
how many countries when they travel? It's like I went to 11 countries.
Yeah, the lists of countries as if so what? And yeah, you went to 11 countries and you're still boring. But that's the biggest change. So I don't think it's civilization. Now, with respect to the idea of history, and with respect to like whether or not those people would have been spontaneous, one, we don't know them, so we can't say. But also, that gives into sort of an idea, almost like the linear idea of, the progressive idea of history, and not linear, the progressive idea. The modern world implicitly gives into the idea of progressive history because it calls itself modern. Now, in 100 or 200 years, we'll look back and we most definitely will say many of the things that we're doing right now aren't modern. The biggest example of this is the way we treat antibiotics and antidepressants, which are the equivalent of hammer and sickle smashing into everyone's brain who is using them. But this might not be the best. What is the best? Once again, you can see that that's giving into a quantified view of even history, because the idea of modernity, of something being modern, it's assuming it's newer, it's better, it's faster, it's stronger, it's more advanced, etc., which is quantified, because the only way you can measure those things is via quantity. Modernity and quality are really difficult to assimilate together. So it's why religions, as soon as they get close to quantity, they just start to become something else altogether. And in that sense, you give into this progressive view of history that we're in the modern world. Every single thing that came before it, even back to like now, the 70s, the 80s, even as early as the 90s, well, everyone who lived then wasn't living the life we are living. They aren't living the amazing life we are living. As if these people believe in it, they genuinely believe deep down that every single basically human civilization up until now has just been living this miserable existence. Everyone in Victorian England was basically saying to each other, "Oh my God, I can't wait. I can't wait until they develop the modern world." Right? No. People were fine. They got on with their lives. They were happy enough. Right? It's a stupid, lazy view of history.
Well, you notice that the particularly in Victorian England, or well, in the late stages of Victorian England, that they were plagued by many of the same fears that we have, right? Very, very similar. That they were worried. They were worried about, the impact that industry was having on the vitality of the nation, so on and so forth. There's a lot of parallels, I think.
Well, it's in the Gospels. There's nothing new under the sun. It's the same cyclical view of history, which I mostly do abide by. Humans don't change. Humans don't change all that much. And I don't mean that in a pessimistic way, and I don't mean that in an optimistic way. So some people say some people say that when they read history, they're depressed because everyone's so alike us. There's historic readings of ancient Rome where kids are having chariot races in the streets, and the older people are saying they don't like the younger kids' new music, and this is in ancient Rome. And so you look back and they go, "Oh God, we don't change at all, do we?" Right? And that's really depressing because man isn't changing. And some people would read that and they'd say, actually, it's quite comforting because humans have been struggling with the same existential and cultural problems that we've had all along, and not much that changes. And for me, that's really a look at the fact that the individual and the individual's free will, to be able to now grasp that information and use it and understand that it's completely within your power to sort of break free and go into your own investigations about these problems.
Yeah, I was going to relate it back to this what you said about quality and quantity. I suspect that many of the people who listen to your podcast are probably interested in thinkers like Mark Fisher. And I have friends who are interested in Mark Fisher too. I suspect that a lot of the people who listen are probably sympathetic towards socialism and Marxism. Now, my main reservation with Marxism is I don't think that like the young Marx, his critique of alienation, I think that much of what he said was correct, but the Marxist solution, if you will, it fell into the exact same problem, right? Of this quantity quality, right? Where it was obsessed with quantification, right? It was obsessed with just, how many boots can we make or whatever. And it just did so in a less productive and actually it just did it less well, right? So really what you're talking about, I think that really what we're talking about here is something quite different. That's why you say exiting modernity rather than exiting capitalism, because you recognize the problem.
I like capitalism. That's the problem.
Yeah. No. I do as well. I do as well. I think that I like capitalism as well. It's in some ways
the big problem with Marxism with regard to Das Kapital, which is what Das Kapital critique of political economy, I believe is a subtitle. The Marxist economics is that term Marxist economics is a complete fallacy. Economics is you could say it's quantified, but it's pure quantity, pure quantification. You can't bring emotions into it. You can't bring revolutionary emotional attitudes into economics, because as soon as you're doing it, you're obfuscating the quantification in the mathematics, and it suddenly becomes not economics. And so there's no such thing. It's nonsense. You either have a politics which then has to start playing around with the economics in an artificial sense, which isn't just allowing the economics to do what economics is, or you have capitalism, which is, and true capitalism is just allow free, laissez-faire, allow the free market to do what it will. And I'm, in the sense that I say I like capitalism in the sense that when I look around my world, everything that works well and everything that has brought me comfort, contentment, options in this world, specifically this world, has been because of capitalism, because of the free market. Everything that I've ever had to come into contact with respect to the state has been, one, terrible, and two, as a system would have been better if it had just been a free market system.
And also just sort of relating it to what we've been talking about, laissez-faire, that most people don't realize. Like, that's the reason why I hate when people talk about neoliberalism, capitalism, etc., like as if that's the main problem, is that it overlooks the fact that there's huge levels of intervention in the market. And actually, in fact, life would probably be more spontaneous and actually a little more wild if we genuinely did have more capitalism rather than less. Like,
I don't. It would be wild. I don't know how it would be wild. I think it would be more organized. Because
not wild. I'm saying. Sorry, go on.
Well, capitalism organizes itself just in relation to people's preferences. And if you want to change those preferences, then what you have to do as a state is to artificially bugger up the economy, bugger up the free market. And you see this basically is what's happening in one of the major reasons it's happening in Germany with respect to the gas. But we don't have to get into it. But I do know what you mean by free and wild, in the sense that people are just left alone to do what they want to do. And that was why when I went back to that idea of people just having there's nothing wrong with just having a basic standard of living. It's my personal opinion that most people don't want to be a revolutionary. Most people don't want to be a millionaire. Most people don't. When people say they want to be a millionaire, I think what's beneath those words is they want to live a life of comfort and ease and security. And if they knew that they could do that on the basic income, which they certainly can't under the current state system, and I think it's to do with the state, that's where the worries come in. And that's where the insecurity comes in. But most people just want to live a normal life.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the state's interventions into capitalism is ultimately why there's most of the problems with capitalism. You look at any of the if you find any of the major problems with capitalism, you trace it to its root, it's because of something the state did, because it's intervened. The free market system is something pretty damn beautiful because it is basically organized of what is known as revealed preference. People say, now I have to emphasize that, people say and proclaim they want X, Y, and Z, but in purchasing and in doing economic acts, they reveal what their real preference is. And that's how the market works. And so, the way things are is the way people want them to be. And so then the government comes in and they do certain things, and all of a sudden you have this artificial either growth or artificial degrowth. I mean, we're seeing this in the UK with respect to the absolute limitations on the houses being built, and that's down to government intervention. And all of a sudden everything's fucked because of, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to cuss, but
no, it's fine.
Because of state intervention. Now, caveat to that, I don't believe there's a perfect system for anything. I think capitalism is the closest. Capitalism and free market, complete free market, is as close as one can get, because it gives people the option to live. It gives people the closest they can get to giving them the option to live as they want to live.
Mm. Yeah, actually, and that's interesting, because you imagine that a free market would actually enable those who do wish to exit. And paradoxically, like if you wish to exit, it actually enables you to do so, much more so than yeah. And what actually perhaps prevents you is, like you said, these interventions which constantly lead to a rise in the cost of living. Like it's like right now, it's, you forget just how little, like the level of economic illiteracy right now in Australia. Like the idea is being popularized that the reason inflation is occurring is because business executives are taking bonuses or something like that. So it's like, it has nothing to do with the amount of money that we printed.
There is one single reason for inflation, and that's for the government is printing more money.
But the thing is, that idea is so basic
for inflation.
Yeah, the idea is so basic, and they don't. But that idea, which is taken as a given by most people, is actually not that widespread, and people don't.
People believe what they want to believe. Well, that's not an idea. I mean, it's not necessarily an idea, because that's what inflation is the devaluation of money by imprinting more of it, right? And in the government, I mean, in America, I mean, the amazing statistic, I mean, 70% of any money that's ever existed has been printed in the last 3 months. No, sorry, the last 2 years. 70%.
It's insane.
Yeah, it's insane.
So am I right in thinking that, like, I mean, if I look at your life, I see someone who is living in rural England, is using the products of technology to create things and live in some ways outside of the system. And I imagine you're going to do that more and more as you grow, get more and more separate from it. But it seems like that would not be possible without the fruits of capitalism. So in a weird way, again, it's like all of these things are going back to that Heidegger quote. It's like, well, there's a great danger, there's great potential, and I guess that's what you're trying to get people aware of, is the fact that, like, there is still tons of things you can do. The things that are trapping you are your mindset. That's the reason why you don't focus on going and starting the homestead. Instead, you focus on these mental practices.
No, because the whole homestead thing is, when someone says you should start a homestead, and that sounds like something you want to do. If people want to start a homestead, then just go start a homestead. I'm not here to tell people what to do, because that may very well be the wrong thing for some people. Not everyone can have a homestead, and not everyone can also be a pretentious podcaster who lives below the poverty line and basically lives like a monastic, right? So if you want to go be a millionaire who owns a yacht and buys the newest Funko Pop, you're free to do it. That might be where you find contentment. The point is to begin from the assumptions.
Nice. If you don't mind me asking, obviously, what sort of part of England do you live in?
Southeast.
Southeast, right? Yeah. Well, my family is from Yorkshire, so I've spent a lot of time up there. I'm not sure if you've spent any time there, but it's very beautiful.
I have family from Yorkshire, so I'm sort of like 50% northern.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well,
I spent some time in York.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Beautiful city. And so is I enjoy going to places like Whitby. And anyway. Well, it's been fantastic speaking to you, James. It's actually been very illuminating. I hope you keep up all the great work. Perhaps you could just finish off by telling people not just where to find you, but some stuff you're working on at the moment.
Sure. I mean, so find the podcast is anchor.fm/Hermetics, HERMITIX, Hermitix, or it's hermetics.net. So that's for the podcast. And then my own website is now jdemeta.net. And if you go to jdemeta.net, and then there's a section for my books, you can now get all of my books in digital form for free. Or there's the Amazon links there as well if you want to buy the paperback versions. I am currently working on another book regarding exiting modernity, which I'll probably have to create some better name for it. But it's going to be a much more tightly woven almost like a system of how these presumptions are built up, beginning from freedom and then going through things much more systematically to look at all the presumptions that we have, and not written in essay form, but written as a complete book, probably maybe 200 pages or so. I don't really like super long books. And really that one will be much more of a clear guide as to what someone can really do in this situation. So that's what I'm working on in terms of writing. Obviously, I'm always doing more stuff on the podcast. And yeah, there's a few other little projects that I'm working on, but keep them under wraps.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Keep up the great work, and hopefully speak to you again sometime in the future.
Yeah, man. Sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome.